The town was unassuming, tucked between rolling hills and a stretch of endless highway. It was where life moved to its quiet rhythm, untouched by the frenetic pace of the outside world. The air was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of blooming wildflowers mingled with the earthy scent of the cobblestone streets. For the locals, this was just another ordinary afternoon. For Nathan Carter, however, it was another stop on a business trip, a brief, insignificant pause in his relentless march toward success. Nathan, one of the country's most prominent tech moguls, was here for a land acquisition deal. A routine transaction barely warranted his attention. Dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, he looked every inch the high-powered businessman. Yet, amidst the town's casual charm, his presence felt like a misplaced puzzle piece. He was just another outsider to the townsfolk, his polished shoes clicking against the worn cobblestones as he navigated the modest town square with an air of detached purpose. As Nathan paused by an old fountain in the center of the square, his gaze remained glued to his phone screen. Numbers and documents flashed before his eyes, and the world around him was reduced to mere background noise. The hum of life, the chatter of vendors, the distant bark of a dog, the laughter of children playing, barely registered. For someone whose life revolved around controlling every aspect of his reality, this sleepy little town was nothing more than a backdrop to his ambition. But as Nathan would soon learn, life has a way of pulling us out of our carefully constructed worlds. While reviewing a critical email, he felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. Startled, he looked down to see a small boy staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, his face bright with innocence and mischief. He clutched a weathered teddy bear, its fur worn and patched from years of love. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, his voice clear yet soft, cutting through the haze of Nathan's focus. Nathan blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. This was a disruption he hadn't anticipated. His world didn't leave room for unplanned encounters, let alone a child standing before him with such confidence. "What is it?" Nathan asked, his tone firm but not unkind, masking the unease creeping into his chest. The boy grinned, revealing a gap where his front teeth should have been. "You have the same mark as my grandpa." Nathan frowned, unsure of what the boy meant, until the child pointed at his wrist. Then, he noticed the peculiar birthmark he had carried since birth, a dark, jagged shape, like a small shadow etched into his skin. He had never given it much thought, dismissing it as nothing more than an odd quirk of genetics. But the boy's words hit him like a ripple disturbing still water. The air around him seemed to shift, the quiet town suddenly alive with an unspoken tension. Nathan's chest tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't quite name. An unfamiliar stirring deep within as if a long-buried part of him had been awakened. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. The boy pointed again, this time at Nathan's wrist. "My grandpa has a mark just like yours. Right here." Nathan froze, his carefully composed world suddenly feeling unsteady. The boy's words were simple, innocent. Yet, they carried the weight of something far more profound, a link to a past Nathan had never sought to uncover. And just like that, the town he had dismissed as insignificant became the starting point of a journey he never expected to take. Nathan's pulse quickened as he processed the boy's words. A birthmark? The same as his? The notion seemed absurd, yet the boy spoke with the innocent certainty of a child who believed everything he said was true. "What's your name?" Nathan asked, his voice steadier now, though a storm brewed inside him. "Ethan," the boy replied with a proud smile, his tiny hands cradling the worn teddy bear. "And my grandpa's name is Thomas. He's right over there." Ethan pointed to a bench across the square where an older man sat, feeding pigeons with deliberate care. The man's weathered face spoke of decades of hard work and quiet wisdom. His silver hair caught the sunlight, and though his movements were slow, there was a calm dignity in how he carried himself. Nathan's gaze lingered on the man, a peculiar sense of familiarity tugging at the edges of his mind. He couldn't explain it, but something about the older man felt significant. "Are you sure?" Nathan asked, his voice lowering as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile moment. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. Grandpa says it's a family mark. He always tells me it's special. Nathan's chest tightened further. A family mark? That didn't make sense. He had no family. He was adopted as a baby, his birth parents nothing more than an unopened chapter in his life story. He had spent years burying any curiosity about his origins beneath layers of ambition and success. What was the point of looking back when he had already built a life that most people envied? But now, this boy, this innocent, unassuming child, was pulling him into the one part of his life he had always avoided. Would you like to meet him? Ethan asked, his bright eyes filled with excitement. Nathan hesitated, his instinct to retreat warring with a growing curiosity he couldn't suppress. For a man who prided himself on control, confronting an unknown piece of his past felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. All right, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Nathan could change his mind, Ethan grabbed his hand and led him across the square with the unshakable confidence of a child who believed everything would turn out fine. As they approached, the older man looked up from his pigeons, his piercing gaze locking onto Nathan's. For a moment, the world seemed to be still. The sounds of the square, the laughter of children, the rustling of leaves, faded into the background. Nathan felt he was walking toward something far more significant than himself, something he couldn't yet comprehend. Ethan ran ahead, his voice carrying across the square. Grandpa, this is him, the man with the mark, just like yours. The older man's hand froze mid-air, the breadcrumbs falling from his fingers. His eyes widened as he took in Nathan's face, then dropped to his wrist, where the birthmark was partially visible beneath the cuff of his suit. My God, the old man murmured, his voice thick with emotion. It can't be. Nathan stood frozen, his polished shoes rooted to the cobblestone as if the ground had turned quicksand. The older man rose from the bench slowly, his joints creaking with the effort, but his eyes never left Nathan's. May I? The man asked, his voice trembling as he motioned toward Nathan's wrist. Nathan hesitated but nodded, pulling back his sleeve to reveal the dark, jagged birthmark. The older man reached out, his fingers brushing lightly over the mark as if touching it would confirm what his heart already knew. It's the same, the man whispered, his voice breaking. The same. Nathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. What does it mean? The man stepped back, his expression a mixture of wonder and sorrow. It's a family trait, passed down for generations. I never thought I'd see it again. His voice trailed off as he looked at Nathan with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as though the man could see past the polished exterior to the vulnerable core beneath. Who are you? Nathan asked, his voice sharper than intended, driven by the overwhelming need for answers. The older man's face softened, and he let out a shaky breath. My name is Thomas Carter, and if I'm not mistaken, you're my grandson. The words hit Nathan like a freight train, knocking the air from his lungs. He staggered back a step, his mind reeling. Grandson? That was impossible. He had no family. He had spent his entire life believing that. I don't, Nathan began, but his voice faltered. Thomas's gaze remained steady, though his hands trembled. I lost my son, your father, many years ago. He disappeared without a trace. And now, seeing you here, with that mark, Nathan's hands clenched at his sides, the urge to flee warring with the need to know more. I was adopted, he said finally, his voice low and strained. I don't know anything about my birth family. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded as though he had expected as much. That's what they told me, too. That my boy was gone, taken away by a system that didn't care about families like ours. But I never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. Nathan's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. He had built his life on logic, control, and believing that his past didn't matter. But now, standing before a man who might very well be his grandfather, he felt the ground shift beneath him. Ethan tugged on Nathan's sleeve, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Does this mean we're family? Nathan looked down at the boy, his heart pounding. He didn't have an answer. He didn't know what to say or do for the first time in years. Thomas reached out, placing a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said gently, "but if you're willing, I'd like to talk, to tell you everything I know." Nathan hesitated, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to walk away, to return to the life he knew and leave this Pandora's box unopened. But another part that had always wondered where he came from, even if he never admitted it, urged him to stay. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's talk." The bustling square seemed to fade away as they sat on the bench together, leaving only the two of them. And for the first time in Nathan's meticulously controlled life, he felt the faintest glimmer of something new, something he hadn't realized he was searching for. He wasn't sure where this road would lead, but he knew one thing. He couldn't return now. Nathan sat stiffly on the bench, his mind whirling with thoughts and emotions. The man before him, Thomas Carter, claimed to be his grandfather. It was a truth that Nathan didn't know how to process. He had spent years dismissing the importance of his origins, telling himself that his adoptive family and his accomplishments were enough. Yet here he was, staring into eyes that felt eerily familiar, hearing words that tugged at a part he had long buried. "I don't even know where to begin," Nathan admitted, his voice unusually quiet. He avoided Thomas's gaze, focusing instead on the pigeons pecking at breadcrumbs on the ground. Thomas leaned back slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. "You're not the only one. I've spent decades imagining this moment, but now it's here. It's overwhelming." He glanced at Nathan's wrist again, as though the birthmark were a bridge connecting their lives. "Tell me about yourself, Nathan. What kind of man have you become?" The question caught Nathan off guard. He wasn't used to people asking about him in a way that felt so personal. Most wanted to know about his success, wealth, and business ventures. But Thomas's question carried no agenda, no expectations. It was simply a grandfather wanting to know his grandson. "I've built a life," Nathan said cautiously, unsure how much to reveal. "I run a tech company. It's successful." The word felt hollow as it left his lips. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's good. I'm proud of you for that. But success doesn't always fill the spaces we carry inside, does it?" Nathan froze. How did this man, a stranger, seem to know the very thing he tried so hard to ignore? He glanced at Thomas, his jaw tightening. "I don't think I'm ready for this," he admitted, the words bitter in his mouth. "It's too much." Thomas reached out, his hand resting gently on Nathan's arm. "It's okay to feel that way," he said softly. "But sometimes, the things we're not ready for are the ones we need the most." The weight of Thomas's words settled over Nathan, pressing against the walls he had spent years building around himself. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong, if there was more to life than the controlled, isolated existence he had constructed. Ethan darted around the square as they spoke, his laughter cutting through the heavy air like sunlight through a storm. Nathan watched the boy with a mixture of awe and envy. How did he hold onto such pure joy in a world that felt so complicated? "Ethan reminds me of someone," Thomas said, following Nathan's gaze. "Your father, David. He had that same spark when he was young." The mention of Nathan's father sent a jolt through him. "What was he like?" he asked before he could stop himself. Thomas's eyes softened, and a wistful smile crossed his face. He was brilliant, curious, always asking questions about how the world worked. He wanted to make a difference, but life had other plans. His voice faltered, and he looked away. "Losing him broke me, Nathan. But seeing you now, it feels like a piece of him has returned." The emotion in Thomas's voice was undeniable, tugging at something deep within Nathan. He didn't know if he believed in fate, but this encounter felt too significant to ignore. As the conversation wound down, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, creased photograph. "This was taken when David was about your age," he said, handing it to Nathan. Nathan took the photograph hesitantly, his breath catching as he studied the image. The man in the picture was young, confident, and unmistakably familiar. The resemblance was uncanny, a mirror of himself, but from another time. Nathan felt the weight of what he might have lost for the first time. And for the first time, He wondered if it was possible to reclaim it. The next few days were a blur for Nathan. He returned to the city, but the quiet town and its revelations haunted him, haunting his thoughts. He spent his nights staring at the photograph Thomas had given him, unable to shake the image of his father's face. The birthmark he had always dismissed now felt like a key, unlocking doors he wasn't sure he wanted to open. Work became impossible. The deals and deadlines that once consumed him now felt insignificant compared to the questions gnawed at his mind. Who was his father? Why was he given up for adoption? And what kind of life had his family endured after losing him? Driven by a need for answers, Nathan contacted his private investigator, a man he trusted to handle sensitive matters with absolute discretion. "I need you to find everything there is to know about my biological family," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I want the truth." The investigator nodded, making no promises but assuring Nathan he would dig into the past. The wait for answers was agonizing. Nathan spent his days pacing the penthouse floor, his mind replaying every word Thomas had said. He wanted to believe the older man, but doubt lingered, fueled by a lifetime of avoiding the very questions he now sought to answer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the report arrived. Nathan hesitated before opening it, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find, but he knew there was no turning back. The file was a collection of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. As Nathan sifted through the pages, the story of his past unfolded in pieces. His father, David Carter, had been a bright and ambitious man who had fallen on hard times. His mother, Eleanor, was young and vulnerable, overwhelmed by circumstances she couldn't control. They had loved Nathan fiercely, but had been forced to give him up when their lives spiraled beyond their control. Nathan's throat tightened as he read the details of the adoption, how his parents had fought to keep him, only to lose him to a system that offered no mercy. The records included letters Eleanor had written, pleading for updates about her son, letters that had never been answered. But what struck Nathan most was the undeniable proof of Thomas's claim. Buried in the file was a hospital record listing his birth name, Nathaniel Carter. The weight of the truth hit him like a tidal wave, overwhelming and inescapable. He had spent his life running from his past, only to have it find him most unexpectedly. For hours, Nathan sat in silence, the file spread out before him. He felt a strange mix of emotions: anger at the injustice his family had faced, sadness for the years they had lost, and an unfamiliar sense of longing for the connection he had always denied himself. When his phone buzzed, he didn't need to check to know it was Thomas. He considered ignoring it for a moment, retreating back into the safety of his isolated life. But then he thought of Ethan's bright smile, Thomas's trembling hands, and the photograph of his father. With a deep breath, Nathan picked up the phone. "Hello?" Thomas's voice was hesitant but warm. "Nathan, I just wanted to check on you. I know this isn't easy." Nathan closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the phone. "I found the answers," he said quietly. "You were right." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I always knew," he said softly. "From the moment I saw you." Nathan felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what came next. But one thing was clear: he couldn't walk away. "I think we need to talk," Nathan said, his voice steady. "There's a lot I need to understand." Thomas's relief was palpable, and for the first time since their meeting, Nathan felt a glimmer of hope. "Whenever you're ready," Thomas replied. "I'm here." Nathan hung up, staring out at the city lights. For years, he had thought he had everything. Now, he realized he had been missing the one thing he never allowed himself to seek: family. And for the first time, he was ready to find it. Nathan's return to the small town was deliberate and measured. Yet every mile brought a mix of anticipation and unease. He wasn't sure what he would say to Thomas, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding the truth. The photograph of his father and the adoption documents weighed heavily in his mind, stirring a tempest of emotions he hadn't yet sorted. When he arrived at Thomas's house, a modest, weathered home tucked at the edge of a quiet street, Ethan was the first to spot him. The boy's face lit up, and he bolted across the yard, his laughter piercing the stillness. You came back, Ethan exclaimed, grabbing Nathan's hand and tugging him toward the porch. Grandpa said you might. Nathan offered a strained smile, his heart pounding as he approached the door. Before he could knock, it opened to reveal Thomas, his expression a mixture of relief and hesitation. Thank you for coming, Thomas said quietly, stepping aside to let Nathan in. The living room was simple but warm, with well-worn furniture and family photographs lining the walls. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but Nathan barely noticed. His gaze fell on a picture of a young man holding a newborn baby, a man who looked so much like him it made his chest tighten. Is that him? Nathan asked, nodding toward the photograph. Thomas followed his gaze, his eyes softening. Yes, that's your father, David, and that's you in his arms. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Nathan stepped closer, his fingers brushing against the frame. It felt surreal, like looking into a mirror of a life he'd never known. I don't know where to start, Nathan admitted, returning to Thomas. This is all a lot. Thomas gestured toward the couch. Why don't we sit? We can take it one step at a time. Nathan nodded and sat across from Thomas, the space between them filled with unspoken tension. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching out like a fragile thread. I read the documents, Nathan began, his voice steadier than he felt. I saw the letters my mother wrote. I know what happened. Thomas's shoulders sagged, the weight of years of guilt and grief etched into his features. Eleanor was a strong woman, he said softly, but the world wasn't kind to her, or to us. When David disappeared, it broke her spirit. Losing you. It was like losing him all over again. Nathan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Why didn't anyone try to find me? To bring me back? Thomas looked down at his hands, his voice trembling. We tried. God knows we tried. But the system wasn't built for people like us. They closed the records and shut us out. It was too late when we gathered enough strength to fight. Nathan clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. So I grew up not knowing anything. No answers, no connection. Just emptiness. Thomas met his gaze, tears welling in his eyes. I can't change what happened, Nathan. If I could, I'd give anything to undo the pain. But I'm here now and want to make it right, if you'll let me. The sincerity in Thomas's voice cut through Nathan's defenses. He exhaled slowly, the anger giving way to something softer, something he wasn't ready to name. I don't know if I can forgive the past, he said honestly, but I'm willing to try. Thomas reached out, placing a hand on Nathan's shoulder. That's all I could ever ask for. The following weeks marked the beginning of something Nathan never thought he would experience, a connection to the family he never knew. Each visit to Thomas's house revealed more pieces of the puzzle, filling the gaps in his understanding of where he came from. The pain of the past lingered, but it was no longer a barrier. Instead, it became a foundation for rebuilding. Ethan quickly became the glue that held them together. The boy's endless curiosity and boundless energy lightened even the heaviest moments. Nathan found himself drawn to the simplicity of Ethan's world, the way he found joy in the most minor things, like chasing butterflies in the garden or drawing pictures with crayons. One afternoon, as Nathan sat on the porch with Thomas, sipping coffee and watching Ethan play, Thomas broke the silence. You remind me of him, you know, he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Nathan turned to him. My father. Thomas nodded. David had that same fire in his eyes, that drive to make something of himself. But he also had a kind heart. He would have been proud of you. The words hit Nathan harder than he expected. He looked away, his jaw tightening as he fought to control his emotions. I wish I could have known him. Thomas's expression softened. I think, in a way, you do. He lives on in you. Your determination, your strength. You're more like him than you realize. Nathan let the words sink in, a strange mix of sadness and comfort washing over him. For so long, he had defined himself by his success and ability to control every aspect of his life. But now, he was beginning to see that his identity was tied to something more profound, a legacy he hadn't fully understood. Inside the house, Ethan was coloring at the kitchen table. When Nathan walked in, the boy beamed and held up his latest creation. "Look, Uncle Nathan. It's us." Nathan took the drawing, his heart swelling as he studied it. The picture showed him, Thomas and Ethan standing under a big tree, their hands linked. It was simple, almost childlike, but it carried a depth of meaning that took Nathan by surprise. "It's perfect," he said softly, ruffling Ethan's hair. "Thank you." Ethan grinned, his missing teeth making the gesture even more endearing. "You're welcome. Now you can keep it forever." Nathan folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "I will." As Nathan prepared to leave that evening, Thomas walked him to his car. The setting sun bathed the town in a warm, golden glow, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. "I don't know what the future holds," Nathan admitted, leaning against the car door. "But I'm glad I came back." Thomas smiled, his eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "So am I. You've brought something back to this family that we thought we'd lost forever." Nathan nodded, the words settling deep within him. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't running from something but toward it. Toward understanding, toward healing, and perhaps toward a sense of belonging he never thought he'd find. As he drove away, the drawing in his pocket felt heavier than it should have, because it wasn't just paper. It symbolizes the bridges he was beginning to build, not just with his family, but with himself. The quiet hum of the car filled Nathan's ears as he drove back to the city, the landscape shifting from rolling hills to the concrete jungle of his world. Yet his mind wasn't on his skyscraper office or the looming stack of business deals waiting for him. His thoughts lingered on the tiny house, the boy's innocent smile, and the weight of his grandfather's words. "You remind me of him." Nathan had spent decades suppressing any questions about his origins. He told himself that success was his identity and that the past didn't matter. But now, the cracks in that carefully constructed facade were impossible to ignore. Each visit with Thomas and Ethan chipped away at his defenses, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he was, or who he wanted to be. One evening, after days of restless pacing in his sleek, minimalist penthouse, Nathan made a decision. He picked up the phone and called his therapist, Dr. Elaine Rogers, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. "It's been a while," Dr. Rogers said gently when they met in her cozy office, the walls lined with books and calming artwork. Nathan nodded, sitting stiffly in the chair. "I didn't think I'd ever come back here. And yet, here you are," she replied, her tone inviting yet non-judgmental. "What brought you back?" Nathan hesitated, his hands clasped tightly. "I found my biological family. Or, they found me." Dr. Rogers leaned forward slightly, her gaze attentive. "How does that feel?" "Confusing," Nathan admitted, his voice strained. "I've believed I didn't need to know where I came from, but now I'm starting to wonder if I've been wrong. Meeting them, it's stirring up emotions I didn't know I had." Dr. Rogers nodded, her expression understanding. "It's not uncommon. Reconnecting with your roots can open doors to parts of yourself you've kept locked away. But it can also bring up pain, regret, and questions that don't have easy answers." Nathan exhaled sharply, leaning back in the chair. "I don't know what to do with it all. I'm angry at them, myself, the circumstances that led to all of this. But I'm also curious. Maybe this is a chance to fill a gap I didn't even know existed." Dr. Rogers smiled softly. "It sounds like you're on a journey, Nathan. And journeys like this aren't about finding quick solutions. They're about allowing yourself to feel, connect, and rebuild." The session left Nathan feeling lighter, but it also gave him clarity. Healing wouldn't be easy, but it was a path he was finally willing to walk. Nathan's next visit to Thomas's house felt different. The air was more incredible, the crispness of autumn settling into the small town. But warmth and life thrived inside the house, a stark contrast to the sterile coldness of Nathan's home. Ethan greeted him at the door with the same boundless energy as always, tugging him inside to show off his latest drawing. This one was more elaborate, with a treehouse nestled in the family tree's branches. "Do you think we could build one someday?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Nathan knelt beside him, smiling despite himself. "Maybe we could. We'd need a pretty sturdy tree, though. Grandpa knows all about trees." Ethan exclaimed, running off to ask Thomas about tree houses. Nathan shook his head, his smile lingering as he went to the kitchen, where Thomas was preparing tea. The older man glanced up, his face lighting with a warm smile. "You're starting to look more comfortable here," Thomas remarked, pouring 2 cups and motioning for Nathan to sit. "Maybe I am," Nathan admitted, sitting at the worn wooden table. "This place, it feels real. Like the noise of the world doesn't reach here." Thomas nodded knowingly. "That's the beauty of simplicity. It strips away everything unnecessary and shows you what matters." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Nathan spoke again. "Ethan asked if we could build a treehouse." Thomas chuckled, his laugh deep and genuine. "He's always dreaming big. Reminds me of your father." Hearing those words still sent a jolt through Nathan, but it no longer felt unsettling. Instead, it felt grounding. He wanted to know more, to understand the man whose blood ran through his veins. "What was he like?" Nathan asked, his voice softer now. "My father." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as he sifted through memories. "David was a dreamer, much like Ethan. He had big plans and big ideas. But he also had a heart bigger than anyone I've ever known. He would have moved mountains for the people he loved." Nathan absorbed the words, picturing the man in the photograph. "I wish I could have known him." "I think you're learning who he was," Thomas said gently. "Every time you're here, you let yourself be part of this family. You're connecting with him in a way deeper than words." Later that day, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Ethan ran up to Nathan with a handful of wildflowers. "These are for you," he said proudly. Nathan laughed, crouching to accept the bouquet. "Thanks, buddy. They're perfect." Ethan grinned, throwing his arms around Nathan's neck. "I'm glad you're here." Nathan froze for a moment before hugging the boy back. The words struck him in a way he hadn't expected, filling a part of him that had long felt hollow. That evening, as he left Thomas's house, Nathan looked back one last time. The lights spilled from the windows, the faint sound of laughter. It all felt like a glimpse into the life he had been searching for without even realizing it. Nathan allowed himself to smile for the first time, not because of what he had achieved, but because of what he was beginning to find. Nathan's visits to the small town became more frequent. Each time, he felt a more profound connection to Thomas, Ethan, and himself. The quiet rhythm of their lives contrasted sharply with his own, one defined by relentless ambition and isolation. It was as if the town had become a mirror, reflecting the emptiness he had worked so hard to ignore. One chilly Saturday morning, Nathan arrived to find Ethan and Thomas in the yard, raking leaves into piles. The boy's laughter echoed as he leaped into a mound, scattering leaves everywhere. Nathan leaned against his car, watching the scene with a smile he didn't try to suppress. For so long, his emotions had been tightly controlled, locked away behind walls of self-discipline. But here, in this space, he felt safe enough to let them breathe. "Get over here, Uncle Nathan," Ethan shouted, waving him over. "We need help." Nathan shook his head, chuckling as he rolled his sleeves and joined them. They worked side by side for the next hour, raking, piling, and laughing as Ethan tried, and failed, to stay out of the leaves he was supposed to gather. As they sat on the porch afterward, sipping hot cocoa that Thomas had prepared, Nathan looked out over the yard. The laughter, warmth, and simplicity were unlike anything he had experienced in years. "You're a natural at this," Thomas said, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "At what? Raking leaves?" Nathan replied with a grin. "No," Thomas said, his tone softening. "At being part of a family." The words hit Nathan with unexpected force. He looked down at his cocoa, the steam curling into the crisp autumn air. "I didn't think I needed this," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But now that I'm here, I can't imagine returning to how things were." Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's because you're finally letting yourself feel. Life isn't about what you build or achieve, Nathan. It's about the connections you make, the people who share your journey." Nathan met Thomas's gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. For so long, he had defined himself by his success and ability to control every aspect of his life. But now, He was beginning to see that the most accurate form of success wasn't about power or wealth but belonging. The weeks turned into months, and with each visit, Nathan embraced the life he had once avoided. He spent afternoons helping Ethan with school projects, evenings listening to Thomas's stories about his father, and mornings walking through the woods behind the house, lost in thought. But the transformation wasn't without its challenges. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Nathan finally voiced the question that had haunted him. "Why didn't my father fight harder to keep me?" he asked, his tone laced with both sadness and accusation. Thomas sighed, setting down his mug. "Your father didn't give you up willingly, Nathan. The system stepped in when Eleanor became ill, and we lost everything. We fought, but we were out of time and out of resources. They took you before we could find a way to stop them." Nathan stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "I spent my whole life thinking I wasn't wanted." Thomas reached out, placing a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "You were wanted, Nathan, more than anything. But sometimes, life forces choices we don't want to make. Your father loved you fiercely. If he were here now, he'd tell you himself." The weight of Thomas's words settled over Nathan, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the grief he had buried for so long. It wasn't anger anymore, sadness tempered by a newfound understanding. That night, as Nathan lay in the guest room Thomas had insisted he use, he thought about his father. He thought about the sacrifices Thomas and Eleanor had made, the years they had spent searching for him, and the family he had found despite everything. The following day, as the sunlight streamed through the curtains, Nathan made a decision. He stepped into the kitchen, where Thomas poured coffee and Ethan chatted about building a birdhouse. "I want to build something real," Nathan said, interrupting their conversation. Thomas looked up, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" I want to build something here," Nathan explained. "A life. A connection. I don't want to keep leaving." Ethan's face lit up, and he jumped out of his chair. "Does that mean you're staying?" Nathan knelt to meet Ethan's excited gaze. "Not just yet, buddy, but I'll be here more often. For Yo and Grandpa." Thomas's expression softened, and he nodded. "You're always welcome here, Nathan. This is your home as much as it is ours." Nathan smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he wasn't running away from his past. He was running toward his future. As the morning unfolded, they worked together on Ethan's birdhouse, the project turning into a laughter-filled mess of sawdust and crooked nails. But as they stood back to admire their handiwork, a lopsided but sturdy creation, Nathan felt something he hadn't felt in years: joy. It wasn't the fleeting satisfaction of closing a deal or hitting a milestone. It was the quiet, enduring joy of knowing he was part of something bigger than himself. And for the first time, Nathan realized he wasn't just building a birdhouse. He was building a life, a new beginning rooted in love, connection, and the family he never knew he needed. Winter arrived in the small town, blanketing the landscape in soft white snow. Nathan spent more time at Thomas's house, drawn to the warmth of the family he had discovered. He began to understand the rhythm of their lives, the way Thomas's stories brought history to life. Ethan's curiosity turned every moment into an adventure, and the way the house seemed to breathe with the quiet comfort of belonging. As the snow fell gently outside one evening, Nathan sat with Thomas in the living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow across the room. Ethan was sprawled on the floor, carefully assembling a model train set that Nathan had bought him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" Nathan asked suddenly, his voice soft. Thomas looked up from his mug of tea, his eyes thoughtful. "I used to, all the time," he admitted. "I would lie awake at night, imagining the life we could have had if we'd been able to keep you. But life doesn't let us rewrite the past. It only gives us the chance to write the future." Nathan nodded, the weight of those words settling over him. "I used to think the past didn't matter," he said quietly, "but now I realize it's part of who I am. I can't ignore it anymore." Thomas smiled, his expression filled with quiet pride. "That's growth, Nathan. And it's never too late to let the past guide you towards something better." As the evening wore on, Ethan finished his train set and insisted that Nathan help him test it. They spent hours on the floor, laughing as the tiny train chugged around the track. For Nathan, it was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy that reminded him what life could be when he allowed himself to be present. Later that night, as he prepared to leave, Nathan stood by the door, his coat in hand. "You've given me more than I ever thought I needed," he told Thomas. "And I want to give something back." Thomas raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity in his gaze. "What do you mean?" Nathan hesitated, then smiled. "You'll see." A month later, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared, Nathan returned to the town with a plan. He had spent weeks working quietly behind the scenes, using his resources to set something in motion that would honor the family he had found. Nathan gathered Thomas and Ethan in the living room on a bright Saturday morning. "I have something to show you," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. Ethan's eyes lit up. "Is it another train set?" Nathan chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Not quite, but I think you'll like it." He led them outside, where a sleek black SUV waited. The drive was short, but as they descended a familiar road, Thomas began to realize where they were headed. "You didn't," Thomas said, his voice trailing off as they pulled up to the old Carter family property, a sprawling piece of land that had once been a thriving farm but had fallen into disrepair over the years. "I did," Nathan replied, stepping out of the car. He turned to face Thomas, his expression earnest. "This is where it all started, isn't it? This land, this home. It's part of our family's history, and I want to bring it back to life." Thomas's eyes glistened with emotion as he saw the farmhouse's weathered exterior still standing firm despite the years. "It hasn't looked like this in decades," he whispered. "How did you?" Nathan smiled. "I had a little help. I hired a team to restore it. The house, the barn, and the fields are ready for us. For you, for Ethan and me." Ethan ran ahead, his laughter ringing out as he explored the property. Nathan and Thomas followed slowly, the moment's wait settling between them. "You didn't have to do this," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did," Nathan replied firmly, "because this isn't just about me. It's about us. It's about creating something for the future while honoring the past." As they walked through the farmhouse, Thomas pointed out pieces of its history. The dining table where family meals had been shared, the fireplace that had once warmed the entire house, the old swing set in the backyard that Nathan's father had built as a boy. Each memory wove a thread between the past and the present, tying Nathan to a legacy he was finally ready to embrace. When they returned to the porch, Ethan was already planning the garden he wanted to plant. Nathan watched him with a smile, his heart packed in a way he hadn't thought possible. "This place, it's not just a house," Thomas said, his voice quiet. "It symbolizes everything we've been through and still has to build." "Thank you, Nathan." Nathan placed a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "Thank you for finding me, for reminding me what matters." In the weeks that followed, the farmhouse became a hub of activity. Nathan split his time between the city and the town, balancing his business commitments with his newfound family life. He helped Ethan plant his garden, listened to Thomas's stories by the fire, and understood that true success wasn't about what you owned or achieved. It was about the people you shared your life with. One evening, as the sun set over the restored property, Nathan sat on the porch with Thomas and Ethan, the three of them watching the sky turn orange and pink. Ethan leaned against Nathan's side, his head heavy with sleep, while Thomas sat quietly, his face peaceful. For the first time in years, Nathan felt whole. The emptiness that had driven him for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging he hadn't known he was missing. "This is what it means to have a home," Nathan thought, his gaze fixed on the horizon. And in that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Closing reflection, Nathan's journey was not just about discovering his family, but about discovering himself. Through the love of his grandfather, Ethan's innocence, and his father's legacy, he found the courage to embrace the life he had once avoided. And in doing so, he built a future that honored the past while creating a space for something new. A family that would endure for generations to come.